Welcome to the S4 Geo webinar. I'm Roger Baker. Our series brings together geopolitical risk professionals in a variety of industry, technology specialists, corporate officers, government officials, scientists, academics, and other practitioners to gain insights into the myriad ways in which geopolitical dynamics are impacted or impact the global business environment. Today, I'm pleased to be talking with Daniel Rasmus, founder and principal analyst at Serious Insights, where he helps organizations rethink strategy, collaboration, knowledge management, and the future of work. He's an author, a futurist, and University of Washington faculty member who teaches scenario planning in the Communications Leadership Program. And we know that strategic scenarios these days are having a comeback across the business world as rapidly changing global dynamics upend traditional expectations about the flow of global trade, the patterns of regulation, and the frequency of far-reaching disruptions. In March, we discussed scenarios, foresight, and strategic optionality with Rudolf Lohmeyer. Today, we'll continue our exploration of scenarios and their construction and their use with Dan. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Roger. Appreciate it.
Happy to have you here, and let me hand it over to you for your presentation. And for those who are watching, Dan will give his presentation. We'll come back, have a little bit of a talk. You can put your questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time, and we will get to as many of those as possible today. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again, Roger. And I'm going to give you the world's fastest view of a high-level overview of scenario planning. So I'll get started with that. Scenario planning is about practicing the ability to perceive uncertainty and the impact of uncertainty on the future. I don't believe in driving forces, which is one of the kind of precepts of scenario planning, because as we've seen just in the last couple of years, things that we thought were driving forces, things like the rule of law and the strength of American soft power, for instance, those factors that we might have assumed would be ongoing for the foreseeable future have been shifted in ways that we may not have anticipated. So I like to think about scenarios through the lens of uncertainty. And I think the primary value that scenario planning brings is, first of all, helping people determine what those uncertainties are that they're facing within the strategic context that they're looking at. I spend a lot of time thinking about the future of work, and I see scenarios as a way of helping people imagine what could be, and then using those stories, and I think stories is an important piece of this, how we tell the stories, to practice agility. I've been told by HR professionals that this is one of the very few ways that they've actually seen people become more agile, because it's forced them to confront their own assumptions about the future and therefore kind of break loose of those. But it's also great ways of identifying emergent opportunities and avoiding surprises, and we'll talk a little bit more about those as we go forward. This is the futurist dilemma. Any believable prediction will be wrong. Any correct prediction will be unbelievable. Either way, a futurist can't win. He's either dismissed or wrong. So Roger said I was a futurist. I actually don't like that term, because I often have this kind of in the back of my head. I've seen futurists at many conventions and conferences before I ever started in this field, who would get up at the end of the session, the end of 3 days, and say, "Let me tell you what the future is going to be." I had a breakfast meeting with Mikhail Macau once talking about this, and he said, Dan, the trick to being a futurist is never forecast anything that's going to happen before you do. And so I try to avoid being a futurist, because I don't know any better than you do what's going to happen in the future. What I do know is how to think about it in a robust way, how to define the uncertainties, and how to get us to the point that we can have stories that are meaningful to the work that we do. And use those stories for various things, right? So we can rethink from strategy, is where scenario planning came from. How do we think about the strategic impact of various events and movements that are taking place around us? But they can also be used for driving reinvention. How do we rethink a business in the face of change? How do we drive innovation? How do we think about capacity building? do what I call agile thinking workshops, which are an introduction to scenario planning, much longer version than you today, where I impart this skill. And so for high potentials and for leaders in organizations, how do you build the muscle memory for doing scenario planning so that it becomes something that you do? It's part of your portfolio. And then visioning. How do we think about the future? I think most organizations do a pretty poor job of thinking about what their future vision is going to be, because they don't think about the underlying uncertainties and they make assertions that they not be able to hold up to. And if they had thought about it, they would have realized that ahead of time. So let me give you a brief scenario about scenarios. This is scenario with a small s. What will work look like in 2036? So you've got this person, is a manager, arm crossed, very stern and, very, uh, demanding of you as an MBA person from, a prestigious college, and you're being asked to say, here's what work is going to look like. What we do in our heads and when we think about the stories that we tell, we have a bunch of uncertainties that we have really almost no idea. We've thought about them maybe, but probably not in a very robust way. And so when somebody asks us questions like that, we are often give ourselves I should know, right? I'm smart. I study this area. I'm an expert, and I should know. And what we do is we collapse all of those uncertainties into a series of variables that then tell a story. But we don't test the story. We don't necessarily go back and check these are all the right uncertainties, or there are different ways things could play out because we're under pressure of time. And this is where the opening slide said how we think about the future is dangerous. And this is how most people think about the future. This is a dangerous way of thinking about the future because it's not robust and it's not tested. But then you could say, if I was just a little smarter, if I had a little more data, and so we have, the phonograph is of no commercial value. We have that there's no reason any individual to have a computer in their home, said Ken Olsen, the head of digital equipment in 1977 when he was the head of the largest computer company. No woman in my time will be prime minister or chancellor or foreign secretary, not the top jobs anyway. I wouldn't want to be prime minister. You have to give 100%, said Margaret Thatcher in 1969 before she became prime minister. By 2000, machines will be producing so much that anyone in the US will, in effect, be independently wealthy with government benefits. Non-working families will have an annual income of $30,000 to $40,000, said Time magazine in 1966. So thank you all for joining in your leisure time while you're not working. Lots of investment, lots of smart people, pinnacles of their industries getting it wrong, right? This is one of my favorites. By the year 2000, people will work no more than 4 days a week and less than 8 hours a day with legal holidays and long vacations. This could result in an annual working period of 140 days worked and 218 days off. So for those of you who weren't retired and living on the income of the state, thank you for joining us on your vacation. Herman Kahn was one of the originators of scenario planning, and I always tell my students he should have known better than to say this because there is no way, there is no data. There is no data about the future. If you take nothing else away from this talk, there's no data about the future. I mean, the signals, the statistics, anything else that we think we know about the future by extrapolating, it's all just that. It is a statistical guess. And I know we're now living in a world where statistical guesses are the thing that we do every day with our friends from AI. But when we're thinking about the future, it's better to say, what are the possibilities rather than saying what's the most probable thing to happen. And this came, scenario planning came from the oil and gas industry. And I give you this 2018 forecast. It's the image I have of how poor their forecasts are, which is one of the reasons they did this. It's volatile. It's impossible to forecast all of the variables. So let's create stories that help us think about what if these things happen, what would we do? Let's practice our strategic options. Let's create contingencies that are viable in the face of uncertainty and then monitor what's going to happen. And so the scenario planner's brain becomes strategic and cyclical, holistic looking. It's one of my, it's one of the great challenges and joys and burdens of being a scenario planner versus being a futurist. I don't have to pretend I know, but there is an expectation that I know a lot about a lot of things. And so thinking holistically and bringing things together. This balance between pleasure and analysis, right? So I have to make a decision. I have to make a decision because this is the real world, right? I can't just live in these speculative places. But on the other hand, I can't make decisions based on the data that I have because I'm moving into an uncertain future. And so I have to balance the two of them, tell the stories, practice the future, think about what could be, and then ultimately think about what it is that I can do. But ideally, I've designed visions and features and functions and the business itself in a way that's adaptive because I've thought about what could be. All of the uncertainties that we do are based around, in my practice, called STEEP, social, technical, economic, environmental, and political. There are other versions of this, like PESTLE, which add legal into this. I put that in the political realm and in the social realm. We don't miss things because we use different names, but this is an organizing way of both creating the brain factors that make sure that you've got these areas covered and also a way of organizing them for when you're doing documentation and other things. The practice is pretty simple. What are we solving for, right? What's the future of work going to look like in 2026? We identify the context and the driving forces. And then we think about the priorities. So there's a voting process that goes on that gets you to the set of uncertainties that you use to drive it. And then you eventually come up with the matrix. I'm not going to share the magic of how you go from 120 uncertainties into a matrix. And I can talk about that later if you want. And then I think most importantly, and what happens with a lot of organizations is they forget the next column here, right? They may go off and identify some implications. They may take some actions. They may identify some contingencies. We did that. Thank you. We're done. But that's not enough. They should start thinking about early indicators and they should then observe and interpret what's happening in the real world. And literally every time they make a strategic decision and they fulfill part of their strategic plan and they say, we have accomplished this, they need to then say, are the things that we are looking at going forward still relevant? We have actually changed the future by executing this thing. Has the future changed? Have the underlying principles changed? Have they our scenarios? And if not, great. But we also have changed the future by executing our own plans. And how do the new plans play out in the face of new reality, right? And so this is an ongoing process. It is not something that you do in a workshop and you walk away from it. Um, I do a lot of work with technology and with technology conferences. Next week, I'm going to be at Comic-Con talking about the science of science fiction, where I'll be talking about artificial intelligence. Um, and I like William Gibson's quote of as I've said many times, the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. So a lot of times people will look at the stories and go, oh, yeah, I think that's already kind of happening someplace. Absolutely true, right? But it's not happening everywhere. And so the world, Thomas Friedman at one point, when I was at Microsoft, they were handing out the Thomas Friedman book, The World is Flat. And I said, the world is a big, fat, lumpy mess. And so in the future, we don't know what it's going to be. And we can't anticipate it without thinking about what are the variables, where do they lie, and how do we work through those. Very quick overview of the future of work. These are some of the high-level uncertainty, everything from employment regulation to agent identity and accountability, because we're now treating AI as an employee. So when we talk about an employment regulation, are we also talking about artificial life forms that are being employed? Power allocation, the global economic leadership, skills acquisition and workforce adaptability, AI regulation, social cohesion and civic legitimacy, migration, and what is a viable geography in the future. Lots of very deep and heady subjects that have pages and pages of documentation behind them. So when I go through the voting process, everybody gets a briefing book and they get these. Then we say which ones of these are the most important and uncertain, both of those factors at the same time. And in the recent work that I did at the University of Washington with my learners, we did a work set of scenarios that looked at power allocation and automation based and AI substitution. We came up with 4 different features: permission, prosperity, rediscovering agency, the friction age, and the reliability dividend. We don't have time to go into a bunch of, the bunch of detail, but here's some very high level overview of those. Permission, prosperity, access requires permission. So this is a world of highly diverse and segmented populations that are based on power and your role of having power within the organization. The friction age, which is a world of high regulation and everything is hard to do. A rediscovering agency where we actually bring community in and community and the use of AI becomes a civic infrastructure. And the reliability dividend, which is not a utopia, but it's a very hopeful future. I often say that these none of these are endpoints because we're trying to speculate what might look like in 10 years. None of them are the end, right? They're all in the process of becoming themselves, and there's something after them, right? And so these are moments in time, snapshots in time of the what could be possible. And the reliability dividend, as much as we might say we don't want a permission prosperity future, we'd like to have the reliability dividend. You have to have both a negative case, it's just a negative case, but a subtly negative case that's got a lot of character to it to deal with those things. And then one that's relatively positive, but not overtly utopian to the point that you can imagine it happening and thinking about how you get there, right? And if you can't create that future, one of the values of scenario planning is to help you imagine the good, not just avoid the risk, not just figure out how to avoid and navigate uncertainty, but also leverage it and how to make things better by anticipating what might be bad and how do we avoid those so that we can make a better future. And then there's a whole set of things just about AI. The point here is that you can drill into the features and ask any questions. So I have these. I also have a set that I'm giving next week at Comic-Con in San Diego on the future of libraries, derived from these. What do libraries look like in these futures? And I've done work with future of work scenarios that I did at Microsoft on the future of money, the future of HR, the future of manufacturing, any area that you can imagine, we can wind tunnel that through these scenarios and think about what the implications are for those areas. And I'll take a breath while I unshare the slides. I have Agile Think workshops, which are day-long workshops that I give on how to think about scenarios, which is much more intensive and much more hands-on for you if you're interested. And then innovation workshops that take a problem that you're trying to face and use the systems to help you work through that problem. So at this point, I'm going to unshare and I will turn off the sharing here and we'll go back to Roger and see if I've spurred any questions or speculations or challenges from as we go forward.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. You went even faster than I would have gone through it. And for those watching again, I see some of the questions coming in. We'll start to get to those. I want to take my prerogative as the host and run through a couple of issues, and then we'll start integrating the Q&A from the audience in there. I think one of the things that you bring up that's important is this question of using the right definitions for words and having a common definition of words right at the beginning. So you brought up the issue of drivers or driving forces versus key
Yeah.
forces or core forces that are in there. I know I ran into that issue working a project one time with a particular government agency who we couldn't come to any common understanding. And it turned out their definition of driver was something that never changes. And my definition of driver was something that was shaping and pushing the direction of the
Yeah.
dynamic at that time. And
Yeah.
I considered them flexible and fluid, and they didn't. And how as you go into this process, how how important is it to come to a common set of understandings of what are the terminology using? What do you even mean by a scenario? What are and what aren't scenarios as you go
Yeah.
into this process?
Well, that's one of the reasons that I do the kind of introductory workshops is so that if you do something bigger, you get to the point that you've actually had some of those definitions. I think part of it's the facilitator. There's lots of us that do this. There may, as I'm hinting at, there are people that disagree with the approach to how I define drivers. And so you probably want to have that discussion and make sure that you and your client can come to an agreement. I think it's very hard when you're disagreeing about terminology, which is, kind of not the point of the exercise in the first place, right? When you're disagreeing with terminology, it's hard to have a good project, right? It's hard to do facilitation because they keep going back. There's um, there's a slide that I was taught by the Global Business Network and Peter Schwartz and Lawrence Wilkinson and that team. And I consider them my mentors. And there's a note in their deck of the types of people you'll encounter, the archetypes of people that you'll encounter during a scenario planning session. And all of the things that you can imagine of I'm going to be your leader, everything you say is right versus everything you say is wrong. And there's going to be the skeptic and other people that play different roles. I think having an agreement on the approach is important. And I try to get everybody to that point. And then we have to focus on the real problem, which is defining the uncertainties and making sure we all understand what we're facing. Um, and I think once you get into that, all the kind of the semantic debates about driving forces versus uncertainties falls away. Although you do have, right, ideological encumbrances that may preclude some getting there.
Yeah, I mean, you had a slide up there that uh, my brain just sees things in their pictures. So it was either a fidget spinner or a starfish. But anyway, it it it
Yes.
it laid out different purposes or values one gains out of scenario planning, and I think that it's
Yeah.
important to come back to talk about some of that because for many people, scenario planning is tell me the future or tell me three futures and I'll make my decision about them or be resilient. But as you point out, and I think many of us who do scenario planning point out, scenario planning has lots of different values that aren't necessarily related to understanding the future. A particular one you raised is being aware of our assumptions, right? Making
Right.
our assumptions explicit. What do we believe is the path and the pattern and the most, how are we mentally prioritizing the impacts of different elements that are acting on things and rank
Mhm.
stacking them? Um, and often we'll have conversations with people and think we're saying the same thing. And we'll be arguing over and over again without understanding where the argument comes. And
Right.
that's because we haven't clarified our assumption. So, talk a little bit more about some of these other things that even participating in the scenario planning and scenario building process can help organizations or groups of people discover.
Sure. So let's go back to agile thinking as a thing, right? So I had the young lady with the question in her head and the variables. We have assumptions about the future. In early AI work that I did, we talked about consensus reality, right? We don't facilitate conversation around consensus reality in most organizations, right? Either executives say something and they think that's the truth and that's what everybody believes because they've been told to believe that, or we have discussions that are kind of half baked that we think we've come to consensus without actually ever documenting what that consensus is, right? One of the exercises I've done multiple times with boards of directors and leadership teams is something very simple. I ask them, for instance, give me your top five competitors. Give me a list and secret ballot, right? And then I come up and look up at the fifth and I go, guys, you have 12 of your top five competitors. There's 12 of them, right? And they look at me like, what are you talking about? And I go, you guys don't have the same site. Every day you walk into this room and you talk about the competition and you're not all thinking the same thing. It becomes very visceral at that point, and they go, "Oh, maybe we should," But that's just that's a nugget for that exercise, right? That happens everywhere in the organization all the time on a lot of different topics. And when we're thinking about strategic thinking, that's again why I go back to the how you think about the future is dangerous. You have to get to the point that you're thinking about strategic issues in a common way. That's one of the reasons I go through and I do extensive documentation of the uncertainties, help them understand that, make sure that they actually know what we mean by the different terms, because the terms themselves are abstract, right? And then to your other point about the other things that you can do that are, ancillary to strategic thinking, right? So innovation, it's one of my, favorite ways to use the scenarios. There's also this kind of position within the scenario planning community that everybody has to create their own set of scenarios. Um, that's why I maintain a set of future of work scenarios. I don't necessarily believe that. I think they all work, regardless of what that work is. There's a general way that we think about how we work. And so if somebody asks a question about something else, it can fit into that framework. There's a common way of actually getting to that. And then we can supplement it and complement it with some other things. Will work with them on augmenting some of the stories. But I think as a foundation, you can certainly go in and say, in this kind of future, how would our roadmap work? How would our strategy work? If we're thinking about a new product, what would that look like? If we're thinking about going into a new market, what would that market look like in a few minutes look like this, right? And again, that forces, from the agility standpoint, it forces you to start confronting your assumptions, right? Because the opposite of the, you know, of not knowing is assuming that you know. And again, that's dangerous too. I won't give you the age-old acronym for what assume means, but it is not a good practice, and scenarios I think help challenge that. And there's things like thought leadership marketing, right? And that's one of the things that we did quite effectively at Microsoft was we took the scenarios that were built for strategic thinking around, what kinds of new markets could we go into, and we started talking about the scenarios as a process and a product that we offered to clients to help them think about their futures. And so it became thought leadership content, and we let the clients then, you know, use that for their own purposes.
You also mentioned, I know a lot of people end up taking future scenarios and they are a risk mitigation process, right? It's to identify the risks and then what can we do to avoid risks. And the
Yeah.
thing is, risk is easy. Everything is a risk. So it's easy to write risk stuff.
Yeah.
But you mentioned in here also the value of using these to identify opportunity,
Yeah.
that often the greater volatility, the more differentiated opportunity there could be if you can identify it and look at your strategic capabilities or those you could build and then be able to adapt to that perhaps faster than your competitors, whether it's 5 or 12, and uh, and move around. So talk a little bit about the way in which scenarios can be used for not just risk mitigation, which again is
Yeah.
it's hard to put an ROI on risk mitigation. It's much easier to put an ROI and sell the need for scenario work, and for proper scenario work, not just, as you said,
Yeah.
do it once at the beginning of the year and forget it,
Right.
as an opportunity identifier.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think taking the stories unleashes creativity, right? Because you are constrained often by the boundaries of what your organization gives you permission to think about, right? Scenarios are a bit of a Trojan horse in terms of giving you permission to, and I did some work with a library in Arizona recently, and it was interesting to watch people kind of come out of their shell and go, it's okay to talk about this right now, right? Um, and because when you're thinking about a public sector organization that's managed by a county or city council, and they've got their directives and they've told you what this looks like, being able to have that permission to think about that. And then the other piece of that is, if as we're talking about usually a 10-year horizon, is thinking about what would we need to do to get to that future, right? So, that's one of the reasons that I, completely avoid utopian futures or fully dystopian futures, because you have to be able to think about the how do we get from here to there, right? And in practical steps, right? Because we're still talking about managing toward the future. And if this is a future that you can imagine and you like thinking about what the aspects of that future are, it not only gives you permission to do that, but it also gives you, a sense of direction in terms of how you might go through the process of getting there, which then comes back, by the way, to risk because you start looking at some of the things you go, well, that's a risky move to do that, right? And so, again, going to the uncertainties, thinking about the things that are uncertain and then one thing happens because in a scenario story, something gets asserted as it happened in that future, which then creates a new set of uncertainties and potentially new set of risks, right? I have hopes that somewhere in the Pentagon, for instance, there is a an implications wheel of the what would happen if we do took certain actions, and we thought about the follow-on things that was in place. Organizations should do that universally of thinking about the we're about to make this decision. What are the implications of that decision? And how do they play out? And the scenarios can help drive that conversation about the what are the potential implications of this because they become a creative tool for that, right? And again, that's a futures thing, right? We're making this choice to do this thing today. What are the first order areas it's going to affect? And then if we say this thing's likely to happen, what are the next level order of effect, right? And so it becomes a process of helping facilitate those discussions.
You've talked a couple times in here about the importance of narrative or storytelling. Um, and that you're not just presenting scenarios. I mean, you showed a 4x4 matrix, but there are stories that go
Yeah,
with each of those. There are narratives. There are we can call them future fiction or whatever we want to call them, but there are narratives
yeah,
that
yeah,
go in there. Why do you find the narratives so important to this process? And do you find that it makes it more real for the users or something they can hold better than just charts? Or
yeah.
what's that narrative role in here?
Yeah, so I talk about it as myths about the future that we've crafted because we're storytelling creatures, right? Even if I just have slides, I'm still going to tell a story about what's on those slides, right? People learn in different ways. People engage with content in different ways. I saw some pretty damning evidence the other day for at least the Americans' propensity to not read as much in the Atlantic the other day, and which is a bit disheartening. We're also simplifying what we read. But I'm hopeful that we can we are storytelling creatures. That's what we do, regardless of how we consume the stories, right? Because with all of the uh, talk right now around the audit, right? We have to remember that that was an epic poem told by somebody 500 years after the events that took place, right? And so it is a work of fiction. It is a story that has existed for millennia. Um, and that's what we do. And so I find the stories as a connective tissue because if you're going to do the kinds of things I challenge you to do during scenario planning, you have to have an emotional stake in it, right? You have to feel it. And I think just thinking about the data, and we get so data driven, everything's about the data, right? Um, and often that data doesn't tell a good story, right? We just saw this week the lawsuit against Meta for telling a story about the people they were laying off that was incomplete because they didn't take into account their health situation, right? And so they got laid off because the statistics said that they were not high performers, right? And so we tell stories about all kinds of things, and sometimes the data is just not enough, and we need to find that connective tissue, the characters, right? So there are characters in these stories. I often write them as journal entries, and so it's a first person story about the life and experience of what you do. And then I do day in the life stuff, right? So I have kind of a little analytical overview, have stories that kind of help connect you. I'll do first person things that just go into the what's it like to live in that. And I think about it as the 10,000 and then 100-foot level future. because again, people are going to engage with it in different levels, but you want the kind of the truth of that story to come through all of those vehicles, and they become, a way for people to connect to them.
Yeah, I do a lot of more broader geopolitical scenarios, what's happening in regions, how is the world going to unfold in certain spaces. And the things that I found is that it is if you after you build the scenario, if you tell a compelling story for how you got from now to then, and
Yeah,
it's plausible. It doesn't have to be exactly accurate. And there are dozens of ways you could get from now to then. Um,
right.
but by telling a
Yep,
compelling
absolutely.
story, you move away from the discussion turning into, well, that could never be the future, to a discussion of, oh, if that's the future, how would I think about the impacts and implications for my
Right,
organization and things of that
right,
sort.
right,
So
right.
that storytelling is there. And then as you had very clever titles for each of the scenarios. That's for the top level executives who only read 3 words at a time and don't have time to read the bullet the
Right, right,
story. But
right,
those are
right.
important as well, that they have to
Yeah,
be memorable. They have to be in their memorableness, really explain what's going on in a very small number of words. And so with that
yeah,
narrative storytelling and that thinking about the future differently, I know from my experience, I tell people, yeah, you have to read history and geography and political science, but I also say you have to read national fiction, you have to read science fiction, and you have to start
yeah,
thinking in those holistic ways. What are some of the ways that, I know you've talked about Comic-Con and things like that, so I'm guessing there's
yeah.
some of this there and mythology. What are some of the ways that you suggest people move out of their work-related intentional box to weave in some of these other things that will help them see things from a different perspective or be able to be more compelling in telling a story that will allow us to get to the real deep discussion of what does it mean? How do I think about it? What do I do about it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting challenge, and I think we educate people incorrectly, and we have for a long time, right? So, the Too Big to Know book from Weinberg and Brown, I have to highly recommend it. I don't have the slide in here, but it's something about when the facts aren't the facts, and the room is the smartest the room is the smartest thing in the room, or something along those lines. There's a longer quote for that. Um, but we've done a very effective job, he argues, in segmenting what people are encouraged to know, right? So when you are getting a PhD, they give you, this much of the, go off and study this little corner of the universe, right? Don't be expansive. Don't look at all the other things. Just go do that thing and say, it's my thesis, and I'm gonna, and I think that's wrong. I think we do a disservice to people by not teaching in a holistic way and challenging them to make connections, and to be expansive and to be interested in lots of different things. I think a lot of time education forces people to not like things by the way we teach it. And and it's hard to overcome that when you're dealing with adults who have had that for their entire life, right? One of the exercises I do when I do creativity pieces, and it used to be a lot easier when there were things called magazines. Um, I would take to a magazine rack at a Barnes and Noble, which used to be the whole wall, right? I'd say go through those, and let's say, I worked in aerospace, and let's say we're looking at a satellite dish. Go find circle designs in magazines that have nothing to do with science or technology or anything else. And let's talk about how that makes you think about the way that you could design a satellite dish, right? And so looking for orthogonal inputs that give you a hint of there's another way of thinking about this problem, right? A traditional aerospace one, of course, is, and this is fairly recently even, of looking at the aerodynamics of various extinct creatures, their fossils. They're going, oh, we may not know everything we need to know about aerodynamics. This thing did something I didn't ever imagine, right? Could we make that synthetically? Could we make a mechanical version of that and make things fly differently? Until they saw that fossil, they wouldn't have thought that, right? And so, that kind of, I encourage people, and that's almost all I can do is, and then, I do extensive footnoting and I try to give them, input to, go read these books and stuff. I have pretty low expectations that they have to do that, even for my students. I say, here's a white paper I want you to read, or an academic paper or something. I'm not sure all of them do that. Um, but I think that's something that, when we talk about scenarios, I do quite a bit of work in the future of learning, and that's certainly one of I'll be very honest, it's one of my biases, is that I think we teach people incorrectly, and we need to reimagine how we do that. Interestingly, AI is almost forcing us to do that, because when all the facts are available to you at your fingertips, and you can answer almost any question that academics used to ask you, it becomes incumbent on the academics to start to learn how to ask better questions.
So let's shift track here just a little bit and talk about impacts, implications, and address one of the questions that's been pending. And sorry, I let
Yeah.
it pend so long. Um, when we talk about impacts and implications, you pulled back from that for a moment and said, when we
Yeah.
build scenarios, when you build a scenario, you also have to put in, identify indicators and set up a system to watch and monitor for the indicators to let you know,
Right.
because each scenario is a different future. They're not all equally likely. As the
Right.
future moves forward, the likelihood of particular scenarios is changing, and those indicators, ideally, if you design them right, are setting us up to be able to recognize that we need to stop, take a look, see if we're moving closer to one of these futures, and
Right.
then reassess what that means for us. So how do you describe, or how do you help define, what do we mean when we talk about indicators? What are the processes to define them, and how do we
Yeah.
set up monitoring or warning systems for that?
Yeah, well, there's a number of ways of doing the monitoring systems. I'll start off with I look at the uncertainties as the primary indicators, right? They have different levels and sub uncertainties, and so you can look at those almost as you would any kind of data point and say, let's monitor what's happening with employment policy, right? What's happening in states, what's happening in the U.S. government, what's happening with immigration policy related to employment, et cetera. So we can look at those things, and then determine, for instance, if I'm running a home cleaning service company, I may have challenges when we decide that we're going to enforce, stricter border controls, right? Because some of my workforce actually came from a more view of that, right? And so I then have to watch what that mean, what's happening there, what are the likelihood that that's going to impact my business, and then I then can have the discussions about what that means for me, right? But literally watching those things, their organizations, I know for, the oil and gas industry and aerospace and many others, it's also tied into, if they're doing it right, it's tied into some of their lobbying, because lobbyists don't always just try to take a position. They also are studying the area that they're watching. And so looking at what they're seeing as upcoming legislation, because they're seeing early indicators, what we might call weak signals, early indicators of it looks like there's a bunch of legislators starting to talk about this thing, right? And maybe we should think about what's our position on that. But that gives you a sense of some of that. And picking the ones, it's difficult if you aren't a well-heeled firm to invest in watching all of that stuff all the time. I think it's something that I'm sure you, along with me, would be happy to offer that as a service to people, to help them watch things for the future. Um, but getting to the point, I mean, in the physical world, outside of my office at Microsoft, I had a gigantic workboard. I mean, a full gigantic wall, and I took printouts from web pages and tore magazines, and I would put them in, saying, "This is the future is unfolding. What bothered people, I think. And so would have, product engineers come up and say, here, I got this idea. And I would say, oh, that kind of looks like it fits, the frontier friction future or, or the continental drift or whatever the future was. And I said, but these other futures today are still equally plausible, right? So to your point, yeah, they're not all, I say all of them are going to happen and none of them are going to happen, right? But at the beginning of a process, they all should be equally plausible because you don't know, right? And so to treat them that way, I do not like organizations that immediately upon creating scenarios put probabilities in the quadrants because I think that defeats the purpose of forcing you to confront your assumptions. You're now giving them new assumptions saying this looks like the future, right? So by showing the evidence that these are all unfolding at the same time, it forces people to go, oh, I would have thought this was the future and there would be evidence that that's happening. But you showing me now physically and viscerally in front of my face that they're all kind of unfolding at the same time. And I can't just assume one is going to happen, right? And I think that's a valuable piece of monitoring is to recognize, yes, there will be things that start trending in a particular direction, but they also may within weeks, months, we're talking 10-year horizons, even years, pivot another direction, right? And that's one of the things I think we've learned over the last couple of years is that things that we thought were kind of long-term assumptions can pivot relatively quickly.
Yeah, and I think my experience with scenarios is slightly different. I've worked in four quadrant scenarios, I've worked in plausible future scenarios, I've worked with a lot of companies where what the purpose of the scenario process is may help define that. If it's to think about the variety of futures that could be there and to think big and things like that, the probability shouldn't be there. If it's to say I have to start going in and looking at that against my internal numbers and my risk profiles, and actually start putting numbers against them, then I found that you have to hold the scenario builders to likelihoods and they have to justify likelihoods. And then they set up trackers over time to say, we're seeing these aspects that go in that start altering the likelihood of this future over this time horizon. And so there's different ways I think that come into approaching this. And then for indicators, obviously the best indicator is one that is highly correlative or highly non-correlative with only one of the scenarios.
Yeah.
And those are the ones that you can set up a more intentional monitoring about. But there are also, as you note, sort of soft indicators or early warnings that tell you, hey, it may not be I know which future is going, but we're seeing movement on this.
Right. Right.
It's time to relook, reassess, come back. And I think the ideal would be that you could create Harry Seldon's magic box and it would
Yeah.
just automatically pull everything and
Yeah.
it would tell you the future 10,000 years out. And the reality is not like that. The number of variables is so great that if you were to do it electronically, you would never have enough variables. So in many ways, you have to actually simplify. Well, when you simplify, you know that you're not going to have exacts and perfection. But
Right.
as you noted, and I wrote this down, there is no data about the future um, because it hasn't happened yet, right?
Right.
So we are
Right.
giving approximations of realistic changes that could come to help people assess and anticipate what would I do? What would it mean for me? What are the impacts? What are the implications? What could I do to manage something that's not that exact line, but fits within that space? In some cases, are there things I can change? In some cases, I can't change it, but I can adapt or adjust to it. And so the scenario process itself, I think, often has very different purposes, and therefore
Yeah.
there's half a dozen different very viable tools for scenario building that could be applied in those different cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I showed you the four quadrant run. I would say though that even when you have a company that's trying to make decisions, I very caution against putting the probabilities on there. Because I'd rather see them look at the numbers across the multiple futures rather than just think that there's one, because I think as soon as you discount one, that negates the avoid surprises part of the scenarios, because you're purposely deciding to not look at something. And to me, it's part of the value is forcing your perception to keep looking, even when you're executing, to keep looking out of the corner of your eye in a way that you didn't before, right? And so if you go into the behavior of I've got these and I've made elections and I've gone through the process, I think you lose that ability to look at the corner of your eye if you start focusing everything in front of you, right? So just a caution in that particular situation.
So we can respectfully disagree on that, but I've had all sorts of wonderful
Okay.
disagreements with different folks. Um, and trust me, I went through a whole period where I was very opposed to putting any numbers on scenarios. But in working with businesses, I found for some of them this becomes a useful thing. And again, we've got to think about what's the purpose, right? What are we trying to
Yeah,
get
yeah,
across? What are
absolutely.
we trying to help them accomplish?
Yeah, and as I said, I'm fine with numbers as long as they're not numbers that only go into one space. In your as you're looking at the indicators, you're also saying, okay, so what do the numbers look like over here, right? And eventually the numbers may discount the future, and you may actually collapse into a future, which means you then have to go do the scenarios again because you've actually one of the futures has happened, right? But again, I think the peripheral vision is an important piece of this.
So we've got about 10 more minutes. I want to throw a question at you, and that is for people who want to start, even if they're not going into building scenarios particularly, but who want to
Yeah,
start opening up their thinking to think about the future differently. What are two or three or four things that you would recommend people just start to integrate into their lives or their activities or things of that sort
yeah,
that will help them start to shift their mindset a little to be more aware, more open to the reality that our futures are a lot of potential branches, and no single line is going to really give us the perfect explanation of what's
right,
what's to come.
right. Well, again, that's what in the agile thinking workshop, that's the purpose from a professional development standpoint is to give you that capability. But some of the key takeaways are to recognize that again, there's no data from the future. Um, I ask them to think about uncertainty and get to the point that they're putting sticky notes on their desks and or their virtual desktops that remind them every day that there's something they don't know, right? I mean, all of our lives are spent in business executing our jobs with the expectation we're supposed to either be finding out something that we need to know, or we already know something that somebody else is going to come and tap into that we're supposed to be the expert on, right? And when it comes to thinking about the future, we're all equal on an equal footing of there's a lot of stuff we don't know. And from the personal standpoint, and then from the managerial standpoint, taking that up another level of if these are the things I don't know personally, does my team have a list of the things that we should be thinking about that we don't know? Even if you're not doing scenarios, just admitting to these are factors in the future that are important and critical to the work that we do, and we need to pay attention to them. And then that goes to this level, which we were just discussing in terms of learning, which is the how do I pay attention to them, right? And again, it's not just indicators from an execution standpoint. Once you put a system in place for monitoring futures, it's very different than just saying, I need to pay attention to the world around me. And what does that mean? That means that I take those uncertainties that myself and my team have articulated, and I start looking at it. Do I ever look at political stuff? Do I ever look at environmental things, right? How informed am I about these things? And am I just getting surface level stuff off of podcasts or news reports or opinion pieces? Am I actually looking at the research and the science? Am I looking at multiple perspectives on it rather than just one? Am I biased by what I'm reading, right? and I think bias is a big, is another huge piece of this, is the forcing yourself to confront your biases and say, I'm over prescribing or subscribing to a particular point of view, and therefore, again, not paying attention, using my peripheral vision. And I think those are, that's where people need to start bringing themselves into a mindset, right? I showed the brain of a scenario planner, right? And if you want to achieve that brain, there are things that you need to do, and some of them are difficult for individuals because either they've been trained or they have just a natural inclination to do something, right? The analysis paralysis thing, do I spend all of my time telling the story because I love telling stories, or do I have to actually now decide what those stories mean for my business? I have to do the analytical work underneath the stories because scenario planning isn't just the stories, right? I have to actually make decisions, right? Um, and how do I get myself into that mindset to make those decisions, right? And so, there's a bit of psychological stuff that goes into this, and personal confrontation that you have to, and again, I think, the people who do this, I think come away with a different mindset. I think they are, I won't say better people. I think they're better thinkers, because they're forcing themselves out of their boxes and trying to connect and really pay attention to what's going on.
Yeah, one of the things that I like to tell, because I get a lot of folks going into geopolitical analysis, which is just a slice of this. It's not the scenario is its own thing. There's a Venn
Right.
diagram where they overlap, right? But in that, they say, well, what do you read? What do you do? How do you? And I say, look, I try to recommend keep three books going at the same time, right? And these are real books. It's not a fake
Mhm.
backdrop, right? But,
Yeah.
but keep three books going at the same time. One is on history, politics, you know, geographic locations, regions. It's the meat of what you do, right? It's
Yeah.
the your
Yeah.
specific focus area that you're doing. Although either if you're the Africa analyst, you should be reading about Latin America or like not just your
And
space.
Asia, maybe.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
second would be um, something in science and technology, psychology, biology. Understand what artificial intelligence is, not what some pundit told you it was on a 30-minute or 30-second blurb, right? And start to do that, and then read something in national fiction or science fiction. And the latter because it gives you alternative ways to approach stories. The way narratives are created is different in different geographies of the world, and the story arcs are different. And being able to think in those different perspectives. And then I recommend to people, though, don't read one book at a time, read one in each category at the same time. A little bit here, a little bit here. For those of us who are maybe have a little gray in our beard, we remember when you could watch five different TV shows over a week. You only got one episode a week and you weren't confused.
Right.
Um, but by doing that, you're able to start bridging connections between these different topics. You'll make stupid assessments initially, but over
Right.
time, you'll be able to cross these different themes and ideas and see things in ways that you wouldn't if you were specializing in
Right.
one
Right.
slice.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, but that goes back to the how we teach people, right? So we
Yep.
we don't we're to teach people that they can do math and science and history and things at the same time, but we don't connect them, right? We don't, there's no connective tissue. When you go to your geography class, you don't get information about the map making stuff that was happening, for instance, in World War II, and tie that together. And then in science class, you learn about radar, right? I mean, I have a whole set of things that I've written about, how do we connect learning together? And it's, for people in business and trying to do this on their own, they have to do now take that on themselves, right? To put those connections. And again, I would encourage them as they're reading that, absolutely agree and do that self, right? Is that they think about the inner connections between the things that they're reading, right? And there may not always be one, But sometimes they'll find something that's kind of subtle, and they go, "Oh yeah, there is a connected tissue between these things that I'm looking at," and that may give you again, I think, one of the things that Peter Schwartz and the team talked about, scenarios is re-perceiving the world, right? And so we think about perceiving the world as the just what we see, but when you think about it, you're then re-perceiving it, right? You're adding another layer of cognitive effort to not just see what you see, but to think about what you see.
Well, there's a lot more we could talk about. We've run out of time. I'm sorry about that, but the
Yeah,
scenario issue is really important. We're seeing it everywhere. I want to thank you, Dan, for joining us today. Thanks for your time.
absolutely. Thank you. I look forward to further discussions.
Okay. And we've been talking with Daniel Rasmus, founder and principal analyst of Serious Insights, author, I won't say futurist again, and University of Washington faculty member. And if you want to keep up with S4Geo, you can go to our website and register, keep track of when we're doing webinars, podcasts, other activities, and reach out if you'd like to join our initiative. Thank you all for joining us today.